If you are watching this video, you fall into one of three camps. Number one, you fly helicopters. Number two, you want to fly helicopters. Or number three, you think helicopters are cool. And whichever group you fall into, you have probably heard of the Robinson R22. It is by far the most popular training helicopter in the world. With 2 seats, 2 blades, a 4-cylinder Lycoming engine, it's pretty clear why this helicopter is so popular. And in terms of helicopters, this one is pretty cheap. Its going rate is about $250,000, which is relatively cheap in terms of other helicopters. So because of the wild success of the Robinson R22 and the Robinson R44, you can find these helicopters popping up in multiple different industries in multiple different countries. But this leads to the question, why is the Robinson R22 so difficult to fly? And if you have flown this helicopter, you know how non-intuitive it is. It is a crazy process learning to get control of this helicopter. But let's just look at the basic controls of the helicopter. You have the pedals, which control the direction of the nose by adjusting the tail rotor pitch. You have the collective, which adjusts the amount of lift being produced by increasing the main rotor blade pitch. And you have the cyclic, which directs the thrust to move the helicopter in the desired direction. And the other great thing about the Robinson R22 and the Robinson R44 is they have a governor. So when you increase that collective and you increase the pitch of those blades, that's going to cause drag, which is going to cause the blades to slow down. But we have a system called a governor, which increases the RPM when you raise collective to keep those RPMs spinning. So that governor really takes away a lot of work. So you only have those 3 basic controls, and it makes sense how they all should work. It should be a pretty simple process to learn how to fly it. I mean, if you look at like a manual transmission car, you have the steering wheel, a gas pedal, a brake pedal, a clutch pedal, and then all the different gears and the e-brake. There's so much more going on. I think like a standard manual transmission car looks more complicated than a helicopter. A helicopter looks fairly simple and the controls make pretty good sense. But actually learning how to fly it and control it is so much worse. And the specific reason why it doesn't work exactly how you want it to work when you're learning is not immediately clear. So when I was learning to fly, on the first flight, the instructor handed me controls and I tried to hover. He gave me just the pedals and I was able to control the nose. He gave me the collective and I saw how that worked. And then he handed me the cyclic and I thought I was holding the cyclic still as best I could, but the helicopter was moving in all sorts of directions. We were like doing the pendular action, moving forward, and I just couldn't get it under control. So I chucked it off. I was like, okay, that's the first flight. Obviously, I'm not gonna be good at it. So then the second and third time I tried hovering, same thing, pedals, fairly simple, collective, got it. Hands me the cyclic, and we're moving all over. No control, no feeling, not understanding why the helicopter is not holding itself there when I hold the cyclic there. I would look at the instructor and his hand was still and the helicopter wasn't moving, and then I look at my hand and it's still, but the helicopter's doing all this. Super confused. But like those second and third hours, I chalked it off. I was like, okay, this is what learning looks like. Like, I'm good, it's fine. By the 5th and 6th flight, and I had like 5 or 6 hours at this point, I'm trying to hover the helicopter and I'm holding it as still as I can, and I'm still drifting and moving, and it is not smooth, and after maybe 10 seconds I would lose it every time. I could not keep the helicopter still. By this point I had spent maybe $2,500 and I was extremely frustrated. I was like, I'm like 6 hours into this helicopter, really hard dedicated focus. It's simple, I should be able to just hold the cyclic still and the helicopter shouldn't move, but it wasn't working like that. Eventually on like the 7th or 8th hour I figured it out. But if you have flown the Robinson R22, and specifically if it was like your first time learning how to fly it and it was in that helicopter, you probably experienced something like this. And as an instructor who teaches on the Robinson R22, I would say for most people, those first 4 to 5 hours, they had the same experience as me. The helicopter is out of control. They're trying their best to hold the cyclic still and correct for the movements, but it's not working. And that's just something you have to go through. And if I had to describe the experience, I would say it's and I hated every second of it, and I thought I was. And that's not the same experience everyone has when learning to fly the helicopter. When I teach people in the Robinson R44, they still struggle with it, but they get it a little bit quicker. And I imagine I haven't ever taught in like a Bell 206 or a 407, but I imagine people struggle a little bit, but they get it fairly quickly. But I think the reason why it's so difficult in the Robinson R22 is because of how lightweight the helicopter is. When you think of a Robinson R44 or a 206 or something, that disc is spinning, but there's so much weight underneath it so that when you adjust that disc, it has to move quite a bit of weight with it. With with the R22, I mean, it is just the weight of the engine and then the two people. Very lightweight, and it's producing a lot of thrust and a lot of lift. So any control input, there's not a lot of weight holding that disc back, and the helicopter just can move so freely because it's so lightweight. And I don't think it's just because the Robinson R22 does not have hydraulics. I think it's primarily the weight thing. But because it is so difficult to control and get proficient at, I would actually argue that the R22, like the Cabri, the Cabri G2, those small helicopters are the best helicopters that you can learn to fly on. Here's the thing, if you're doing like an auto rotation in a Robinson R44 or a Bell 206, if you adjust that nose, your RPMs are going to change a little bit, but it's not going to happen super quick. Conversely, in a Robinson R22, because it has such a low inertia rotor system, that when you change the pitch of the nose even just a hair, your RPMs are going to be fluctuating like 10 percentage points. I mean, I remember really struggling with auto rotations. I will link to a video I did right here about why auto rotations are so difficult. But in the R22, if you come back just a quarter of an inch, like just the smallest amount, and you change the pitch a little bit, your RPMs can shoot through the roof so quickly. It can feel totally uncontrollable and unmanageable. Unlike the Robinson R44, which I also teach in, when you enter that auto rotation, if your nose changes, the RPMs will change, but it happens much slower. The RPM decay doesn't happen nearly as fast. But back to the point I was making, this makes these pilots incredibly sharp. When learning to fly it, you get really good at knowing what the helicopter is doing immediately and what your hand is doing. When doing auto rotations, you get really good at knowing what the control inputs are going to do and how they're going to affect the RPMs, because your control inputs affect the RPMs nearly immediately. I truly believe that the smaller the helicopter you learn to fly in, the better the pilot you are. Now, of course, there's tons of other things that make you a good pilot, but really understanding your control inputs and how they affect the helicopter make you pretty sharp. If you learn on like a 407, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's such a big disc and it's so heavy and it's such a high inertia rotor system that you don't really feel the helicopter as much as you do in a 22. And I have heard this story countless times, but people that learned on a turbine helicopter or something big, they cannot fly a Robinson R22, and if they do, they find it extremely challenging. There is not a simple crossover from like a Bell 407 to a Cabri G2 or a Robinson R22. That big helicopter with hydraulics, with a high inertia rotor system, versus something really tiny with that small disc, you can't cross over. However, you can go the other way. You can go from like the Robinson or the Cabri into a 407, and it's going to be different, but you can make the jump. I truly believe that the weight of the helicopter and it being a small inertia rotor system really make you a good pilot, and that's why it's so difficult to fly. It's just hard to get any feedback of what the helicopter is doing because the disc responds so quickly and there's no weight underneath affecting that disc. If you learn to fly in the Robinson R22, let me know down below, how many hours did it take for you to learn how to hover? For me, it was around the 7 or 8 hour mark, but let me know how many hours it took you. And if you want to start flight training, let me know if you would do your training in a Robinson R22 or if you'd want to start in something bigger. And finally, if you learned in like a 407 or a Robinson R66 or some bigger helicopter, like maybe a military helicopter, do you think you could fly the Robinson R22? Let me know down in the comments below. I'm so excited to hear your answers. And if you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button. I'd really appreciate it. Go check out that video that I did about why auto rotations are so hard in the Robinson R22. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you guys on the next one. Take care.